In the 1920s, the occupational therapy profession was introduced to new approaches and movements such as habit training and reconstruction. It was post-World War I, and this decade quickly adopted the name the Roaring Twenties because of the booming economy and found love for music, radio, silent movies, dance, fashion, and style. Society in the 1920s put more of an emphasis on medicine and science to cure illness and disease. This resulted in the healthcare trend of long-term institutionalization for chronic health problems. Between 1917 and 1920, the amount of hospitals more than doubled in the United States, and occupational therapists were now seen as part of a medical team. As this trend progressed, there was an increase in training programs for occupational therapists, as well as the amount of professionals in the field. The habit training approach was developed by Eleanor Clark Slagle alongside psychiatrist Adolf Meyer. Habit training consisted of daily activities including crafts, work, tasks, and group recreations, promoting both mental and physical health for patients with mental illness. Habit training was a holistic approach and meant to restore authentic living to the individuals with disabilities. At the end of World War I, there were many soldiers that were in need of medical attention and needed to be reconstructed. They needed reconditioning through occupations such as handicrafts and manual labor. This started the movement known as the Reconstructionist movement, that was also a holistic approach. This movement also benefited those who were injured from manual labor accidents. The Reconstructionist movement involved retraining, re-educating, and restoring physical and mental functions in order for individuals to re-enter the workplace. It was because of occupational therapists' high involvement with doctors during this movement that occupational therapy became known as a healthcare profession. Using the scientific findings of the 1920s, the biomechanical model began developing. Activity analysis in occupational therapy was used and applied to activities of daily living, and became a frame of reference for treatment.
So in the 1930s, the field of occupational therapy was heavily influenced by biomechanical and behavior modification frames of reference. Historically, however, the 30s were extremely hard years because of the Great Depression, along with Prohibition and the development of organized crime. Politically, there was a lot of turmoil going on due to poverty and unemployment. OTs in these days found themselves in recovering hospitals, sanatoriums, and retreats full of patients with polio, chronic mental illness, or TB. Adaptive crafts were made with weights attached to it, and it was a common way to provide muscle training simultaneous to handcrafting. They institutionalized people with mental retardation or any other developmental disability, but afforded them the care of the most modern scientific treatment of which OT was a part of. The study of human behavior was born in this decade by behaviorists like Watson, Skinner, and Pavlov. These men discovered breakthroughs in about how people learn and why they behave as they do. They used behavior modification as an approach during therapy to extinguish undesirable behaviors. Biomechanical frame of reference also became prominent. And lastly, the national registration for occupational therapists began during this decade.
The 1940s introduced vocational training, activity analysis, and rehabilitation models. The historical events of the 1940s were World War II, the Holocaust, the golden age of jazz, color movies and television were invented, and it was the beginning of the baby boom. Because of World War II, the focus of occupational therapy and health care referred back to vocational rehabilitation. There was a demand to retrain soldiers with disabilities for occupations at home. The New Deal policy that provided Social Security income for those with disabilities and the GI Bill that provided funding for vocational training were positive changes that allowed occupational therapists to be paid for services in physical rehabilitation and pre-vocational training programs. Vocational training programs were used in both mental and physical setting that took place in hospitals. In 1947, the kinetic model was published by Sidney Licht, which gave the scientific basis for activity analysis using a biomechanical frame of reference. Claire Spackman, who interpreted the kinetic model for treating patients with physical injuries, ran occupational therapy workshops to develop the rehabilitation model as well. She focused on task analysis and the adaptation to function in activities of daily living. Fabrication and adaptive equipment was used to support functionality in work, leisure, and self-care activities. In the 1940s, the goal of rehabilitation model was to allow injured patients to return to the employed and live independently.
The 1950s introduced the frames of psychoanalytic and sensory motor to the field of occupational therapy. Huge advancements in the medical field were emerging that were influencing therapy, now allowing patients with schizophrenia and manic depressive illness to engage more in therapy due to the use of major tranquilizers like Thorazine and Librium. OT led with the psychoanalytic frame of reference, implementing craft activities because they were thought to have diagnostic attributes, symbolically depicting the mysterious initial processes of the unconscious mind while engaged. OTs and psychiatrists work collaboratively to enable patients to divulge their fixations and unconscious conflicts. Freud's ideas, along with the object relations theory, influenced occupational therapy to adopt the therapeutic use of self concept during treatment. Neurologic advancements also took place by way of Margaret Rood, who was a researcher trained in occupational therapy and physical therapy. She developed techniques for facilitating reflex and voluntary movement with paralysis patients, which eventually developed into the sensory motor model, which is the basis for the sensory integration model by Ayers. Furthermore, this decade is known for the advent of rock and roll along with vaccines for polio and other diseases.
The 1960s was a time of social reform for occupational therapy. It was a time where authority was questioned, there was sexual revolution, Vietnam War protests, and it marked the end of the baby boom. There was a change in the view of mental institutions as a result of Goffman's book, Asylums, Essays on the Social Situation of Mental Patients and Other Inmates. It gave negative insight to institutions and behaviors that forced conformity. As a result, many institutions either downsized or closed down. Because of the deinstitutionalization movement, occupational therapy was high in demand in mental and physical health care settings to help patients acquire the skills needed for independent living. Patients that were in institutions for years were now going back to the community and needed to learn how to socialize. Occupational therapists needed to now focus on group dynamics and leadership. Occupational therapists taught social skills, communication, cooperation, and mutual respect to groups. In 1969, Gail Fidler published the task-oriented group model for occupational therapists to use as a reference during practice. Also, during the 1960s, there was a passage of Medicare and Medicaid to attempt to make healthcare services available to all citizens. Health services included inpatient, outpatient, day hospital programs, emergency services, consultations, educational programs, and established community and mental health centers in order to transition from long-term hospitals to the community, where they were established because of the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. During the change of organization in institutional treatment settings, occupational therapists became a component of the therapeutic setting. Within this type of approach, patients and staffs met together to discuss treatment goals and to eliminate an imbalance of power between the patients and the therapists. This also encouraged active participation in treatment, goal setting, and making therapeutic behavior changes. Occupational therapy frames of reference that emerged in the 1960s and carried over to the 1970s were Mary Riley's Occupational Behavior in 1962, and A. Jean Aryeh's Sensory Integration in 1968.
An identity crisis shook the field of occupational therapy during the 70s due to a split between specialists in psychiatry and physical disabilities, along with branches in pediatric and geriatric OT, along with hand therapy specialists. The AOTA took a proactive role, to gather the leaders of the field and search for common ground in hopes to describe and pinpoint the profession's domain to the public. Mosey stepped up at this time to name 3 frames of reference for mental health: acquisitional, based on behavioral theory; psychoanalytic, based on object relations; and developmental. And many other leaders published their own as well. Leaders such as Mary Riley, Jane Iris, and Gary Kielhofner also contributed their frames of reference and models, displaying the diversity of the field, with models like play model, prevention model, activity therapy, biopsychosocial model, doing and becoming, temporal adaptation. By the end of the decade, the AOTA presented the Uniform Terminology document in 1979. Sensory integration was introduced during the 1970s, and the growth of cognitive behaviorism boomed. Fortunately, occupational therapy moved into the school system, and the education of children with disabilities was instated. Economically, there was an energy shortage around the country, and runaway inflation was occurring.
The fall of communism and the end of the Cold War marked the historical events of the 1980s. During this decade, standardized assessments and clinical reasoning became a trend for occupational therapy profession. There were 4 problems that were occurring in occupational therapy at this time. These included accountability, manpower shortage, lack of a unified theoretical base, and lack of research to validate the occupational therapy practice. In terms of the theoretical developments, healthcare costs were on the rise, and federal and private healthcare reimbursement sectors supported the cost-cutting measures such as Medicare reform and the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1987. Because new systems were put into place for reimbursement, accountability became a problem for occupational therapy. Therapists were now responsible for providing evidence of the effectiveness of their therapy, proving their clients' progress toward goals. Occupational therapists lacked standardized, valid, and reliable assessment tools. As a result, from 1983 to 1984, the American Occupational Therapy Foundation offered grants to occupational therapy researchers to develop standardized assessment tools for measuring occupational performance. During the 1980s, the Public Law 94-142 was passed and stated that there be a mainstream education of handicapped children in public schools. There became a manpower shortage because of the need for occupational therapists within the classroom and education system. Occupational therapy also became licensed by the state and recognized registered occupational therapists and certified occupational therapist assistants as qualified providers of occupation-based services in acute hospitals, subacute rehabilitation, skilled nursing facilities. There were many new theoretical approaches that were formed during the 1980s along with frames of references and models. The theories were published in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, Occupational Therapy Journal of Research, the Occupational Therapy and Mental Health Journal, as well as others. Frames of reference included Mildred Ross's Sensory Integration Groups for Adults, Guilfoyle and Grady's Spatial Temporal Adaptation in Pediatrics, the Client-Centered Task Force in Canada, Howie and Briggs' Ecological Systems Model, Allen's Cognitive Disability Framework, Arabu and Togia's Cognitive Perceptual Rehabilitation, and Reed's Personal Adaptation Model. More developments included Kielhofner and Burke's Model of Human Occupation, or MOHO, was developed in 1980. Clinical reasoning as a form of inquiry was developed in 1989, and occupational science was also introduced in 1989. There was also a paradigm shift from the biomedical view to a holistic, organismic, and client-centered perspective. MOHO was a special paradigm because it not only encompassed the human open system with mental and physical components, but it also explained human occupation clearly. Clinical reasoning was another approach made by Joan Rogers in 1983. Along with Mattingly and Fleming, they focused on the thought process that occupational therapists use during treatment. They identify procedural, interactive, and conditional reasoning as a three-track mind. The birth of occupational science was the third theoretical achievement of the 1980s. Occupational science was proposed by Elizabeth Yerxa in 1989 as an academic discipline, seeking a better understanding of the form, function, and meaning of occupation. A large contribution of the American Occupational Therapy Association was made in 1989 with efforts to unify the occupational therapy profession by creating a common language and defining our practice. In doing so, the Uniform Terminology for Occupational Therapy second edition was published. This publication defined the intersection of occupational performance areas and performance components. It also clarified the occupational therapist's role in healthcare, setting the stage for more development of occupational performance models.
The decade of the 1990s absolutely brought forth monumental milestones in the production of theoretical occupational performance models for the field. Unfortunately, the organization of the levels of theory confused many occupational therapists and professors trying to parse out the differences between the models, frames of reference, and paradigms. Leaders united all these ideas under the assumption that occupation was central to OT. Models such as Person-Environment Occupational Performance Model, also known as PEOP, Schkaden-Schultz's Occupational Adaptation, Dunn's Ecology of Human Performance, Canadian Model of Occupational Performance, and the Model of Occupational Functioning all sought to do this. Kiel-Hofner continued to make revisions to MOHO, and the AOTA began to revise uniform terminology using the ideas from the OT practice framework that would be published in 2002. Motor learning was also introduced during this decade. The 1990s was also known as the decade of the brain, ushering significant applied theories incorporating new findings in neuroscience and brain research. The World Wide Web heavily influenced these years, and fortunately the economy was booming. Communication technology and the computer became staples of culture, and information exchange was much more readily available. Healthcare saw a growth of HMOs, managed care, and the diagnostic-related groups criteria began to limit healthcare costs. As far as research goes, master's and doctoral level OT students were publishing numerous studies validating the efficacy of OT, which in turn increased recognition and value globally and within the medical field. The job market for OT fruitfully grew during this decade, and the AOTA now demanded that entry-level OT move to a master's level.
During the 21st century, there have been events such as the recession, 9/11 terrorism, the war in Iraq, and Katrina and other natural disasters. The healthcare trends have provided a growth of community-based programs, wellness programs, and family-centered care. In 2001, the WHO revised its classification system that runs alongside the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework. Currently, student enrollment and jobs in our practice have dramatically increased.